The bridge at Harrow Pass had been broken for 11 days when Ellen Garrison arrived with nothing but a mule, a wagon full of salvaged timber, and a stubbornness that the people of Caldera Creek had never seen in a woman before and would never quite forget after. It was the spring of 1874, and the territory of Colorado was still a wild and unforgiving land, the kind of place where the mountains did not care about your name or your grief, or the fact that you had buried your husband only 3 weeks prior in a shallow grave outside of Pueblo. The pass connected the eastern ranching settlements to the mining camps and trading posts on the western side, and without that bridge, a family could not get their cattle to market, a doctor could not reach the sick, and a widow with nothing left on the eastern side had no way to reach whatever she was going to build on the western one. Ellen was 28 years old. She was tall for a woman of her time, lean from years of hard work on the cattle ranch she and her husband Thomas had tried and failed to keep. With dark auburn hair, she kept pinned tightly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to him. Her hands were calloused and strong. Her eyes were a quiet shade of gray-green that people often mistook for cold until they saw what she did when she thought no one was watching, which was notice everything, feel everything, and then fold it all inward like a letter she would never send. Thomas Garrison had been a good man and a decent husband, not a passionate one, but steady, and his death from fever had left Ellen with debts, no land, and a very clear understanding that the world did not arrange itself kindly around women who found themselves alone. She had heard about the pass from a freighter outside Pueblo, a broad-shouldered man named Clement who had shaken his head and said the bridge over Harrow Creek was washed out in the spring flood, and no one was fixing it because the county seat was arguing about jurisdiction and the nearest town was arguing about money, and meanwhile folks on both sides were stranded. Clement had said it like it was simply one more fact about a hard world. Ellen had listened, and something had shifted inside her chest, quiet and decisive as a door closing. She could build things. Thomas had never understood how much she knew about timber framing and joinery, learned from her father, a carpenter in Missouri who had raised her without sons and seen no reason to keep his daughter ignorant. She had helped build barns and wagon covers and the framing of their ranch house. She understood load-bearing angles and the way wood settled under pressure. She understood what a flooded creek did to old rope and rotted support beams, and she needed to get to the western side. She had a letter in her coat pocket from a woman named Dorothea Marsh in a town called Silver Vale, offering work as a seamstress and cook in exchange for room and board until Ellen could save enough to start something of her own. It was not a grand future, but it was a future, and the bridge stood between her and it. So she bought the lumber with the last of her money, loaded it onto a rented mule-drawn wagon, and drove up into the mountains alone. Harrow Pass was a narrow cut through the San Juan foothills, the kind of place that was beautiful in a way that made you slightly afraid, with pine-covered slopes rising sharply on both sides and a creek running cold and fast through the bottom. The bridge that had once crossed it was a sorry sight. The main support beam had snapped clean and washed downstream. 2 of the plank rails remained on the near bank, half submerged in the spring mud. The stone abutments on either side of the creek were still sound, set deeply into the earth on both banks. It was those abutments that made Ellen believe it could be done. She stopped the wagon, climbed down, and stood at the edge of the bank for a long time. The creek was about 22 feet across at this point. Not wide, but the current was strong and the water cold enough to kill a person who fell in and could not get out quickly. She measured the gap with her eye and then walked to both abutments, testing the stone with her hands, pressing and pushing, checking for movement. Neither one shifted. She said to nobody in particular because there was truly nobody there, all right then. She unhitched the mule and staked it on a patch of grass upstream where the grazing was good. She pulled her tools from the wagon bed. She had a broadex, a hand saw, a mallet, iron spikes, rope, and a set of wooden wedges her father had made and given her when she married, telling her that every house needed someone who knew how to hold things together. She had never thought he meant that literally until now. The first day she spent cutting and shaping the main support beams, working steadily from morning until the light went copper and the shadows grew long across the creek. She ate salt pork and hardtack from her pack and drank creek water from her canteen, having filled it upstream above where the mud was disturbed. She built a small fire for warmth, not comfort, the mountain evenings still sharp with cold in early May, and she lay under her bedroll in the wagon bed and listened to the creek and the wind in the pines and let herself be too tired to grieve. She worked through the second day alone, and the third, and by the fourth morning she had the support framework roughed out and was working on positioning the cross beams that would give the structure its lateral strength. Her shoulders ached with a deep, satisfying pain. Her palms had blistered, and the blisters had broken and hardened into new calluses. She had talked to the mule extensively. She had sung 2 hymns she half remembered from her mother's church. She had argued out loud with herself about the correct angle for the notch joints until she settled on 30 degrees and stopped arguing. She did not expect anyone to come. The road was little used while the bridge was out, and she had passed no one on her way up the pass. So when she heard hoofbeats on the morning of the 5th day, she looked up from her work with something closer to wariness than hope. The rider who came around the bend in the pass road was a man on a dark bay horse, and he stopped when he saw her, pulling the horse up short with a quiet ease that spoke of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas duster that had been the color of sand once and was now the color of the earth itself. He had a battered hat pushed back from his face, and the face beneath it was angular and sun-darkened, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark eyes that looked at the bridge framework, and then at her and then at the bridge again with an expression she could not quite read. He sat on his horse for a moment without speaking. Ellen kept working. She had a beam balanced on the near abutment, and she was cutting the notch for the joint, and she was not going to lose her angle just because a stranger had ridden up to stare at her. The man on the horse watched her work the saw through 2 full strokes. Then he said in a voice that was low and unhurried, "That notch is going to bind if you cut it much deeper." Ellen stopped. She looked at the notch. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I have 1 more stroke and I am done with it." He said nothing after that. He sat on his horse and watched for a little while longer, and then he turned around and rode back the way he had come without another word. Ellen listened to his horse's hoofbeats fade, finished her cut, and blew the sawdust from the notch. It fit exactly as she had intended. She did not see him again that day. But the next morning, when she came out from under her bedroll at first light with her back stiff, and the mountain cold still settled in her bones, she found that someone had stacked 2 additional planks of sound pine at the edge of her work area, sawn to roughly the right length, and beside them sat a tin of axle grease that would work equally well for lubricating the wooden wedges against the stone abutment. She stood looking at these things for a moment with her hands on her hips. Then she looked up and down the road and saw nothing except the pale dawn light spreading slowly through the pass. The dark bay horse was not visible anywhere. But she could smell very faintly the ghost of wood smoke from a fire that had burned and been put out, coming from a spot in the trees about 40 yards up the slope. He had camped nearby. He had found lumber somewhere or brought it, and he had left it without waking her, without asking, without attaching any condition or expectation or even a word to the gesture. Ellen picked up one of the planks and turned it in her hands. It was good timber, not green cut, properly seasoned. She ran her thumb along the grain. Someone who knew wood had selected this. She set it down, picked up her broadaxe, and went to work. His name, she would learn eventually and by a sideways route, was Isaiah Hunter. He was 32 years old, a former Army scout who had served with the 7th Cavalry before his conscience, and the events of certain campaigns he would not discuss had led him to take his discharge and his horse, and ride west without a particular destination in mind. He had been moving through the San Juan country for 2 years since then, picking up work where he found it, moving on when the work was done, or when the weight of staying in one place became heavier than the weight of the road. He had a reputation in the small towns and mining camps of the region as a man who worked hard, kept his own counsel, and caused no trouble. The men who had hired him described him as reliable and oddly difficult to remember clearly, not because he was forgettable, but because he was the kind of person who did not push himself into the center of things. He was there, and then he did what needed doing, and somehow the attention always went to the work rather than to the man. He had been riding towards Silver Vale on the western side of the pass for reasons of his own when he came around the bend, and saw a woman standing on a half-finished bridge framework over a flooded creek with a broadaxe in her hand, and a look of such complete and focused determination on her face that he had pulled his horse up before he even thought about doing it. He had not intended to stop. He had not intended to come back. But he had found himself, an hour later, sitting on a fallen log above the road in the trees, and he had been thinking about the angle of that notch joint, and about the fact that she was going to need at least 2 more plank lengths than she had visible in her wagon bed, and about the fact that there was a sawmill 8 miles back down the east road that would sell rough timber by the board foot to anyone who asked. He had done the measuring in his head, almost against his will, and then he had turned his horse around and ridden back to the mill and paid for the boards himself, which was a thing he did not examine too closely, because he suspected the examination would make him feel foolish. He left the boards and the axle grease before first light and positioned himself in the trees to watch from a distance, not to intrude, just to see that the work was going safely. He told himself this was simple practical sense. A woman alone on a construction project over a fast-moving creek in a mountain pass was a situation where accidents happened, and if an accident happened and no one was there, it would be a very stupid and preventable death. He told himself he was being pragmatic. He did not examine why he watched with such particular attention the way her arms moved when she swung the broadaxe, economical and precise, or the way she tilted her head when she was thinking through a problem, or the way she talked to the mule, which he could not hear clearly from his distance, but which appeared to be entirely full sentences delivered with complete seriousness. Ellen noticed him in the trees on the second morning. She did not acknowledge it. She was not afraid of him, which she recognized as either good sense or bad sense depending on how things went, but she had looked at him the previous day and made certain calculations. A man who rode a well-kept horse and gave a quiet, accurate piece of advice, and then left without pressing the matter, was not a threatening man. A man who left good lumber and useful supplies before dawn without waking her or leaving his name was either very thoughtful or very strange, and she had decided she would take thoughtful until given evidence otherwise. On the morning of the 7th day, she ran into a genuine problem. The center span of the bridge required a king post, a vertical support from the main crossbeam up to the ridge beam that would give the whole structure its strength at the middle point over the deepest part of the channel. She had the timber for it. What she did not have was a way to hold the crossbeam in position while she drove the king post into place, because the crossbeam was heavy enough that she could not lift it to the abutment and hold it there and do the driving at the same time. She needed a second set of hands for approximately 20 minutes. She stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the problem and felt a slow, frustrating heat rise in her chest. She thought about the trees. A system of ropes and counterweights was theoretically possible. She could rig something. It would take most of the day and she would lose light. She had already been at this for 6 days, and she could feel the end of it approaching, and she wanted to be done. Wanted to cross this bridge she was building and get to the western side and the life that was waiting there. She put down her tools and walked up the slope into the trees, following the ghost of old wood smoke to a spot behind a large ponderosa pine where she found the cold remains of a fire ring, 2 flat stones arranged for a coffee pot, and a place where a bedroll had been laid out. Recent. He had been here last night. She looked around and said, clearly enough to carry, "I know you are nearby." There was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds. Then Isaiah Hunter stepped out from between two trees about 30 feet to her left, and he was holding a cup of coffee and looking at her with an expression that was caught somewhere between caught out and composed. He was not wearing his duster in the morning warmth, just a collarless shirt and dark trousers and his suspenders, and he was slightly younger looking without the bulk of the coat, though no less solid. Ellen looked at him steadily. "I need help for about 20 minutes, she said. "I need someone to hold a crossbeam on the abutment while I set the king post. After that, I can manage the rest." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that she was beginning to understand contained a great deal of activity that never reached his face. Then he said, "All right." That was all he said. They went down to the bridge together, and she showed him where to stand and how to brace his weight against the crossbeam to hold it level, while she worked the king post into position from the center. She gave precise instructions, and he followed them without comment, without offering suggestions, without doing anything except exactly what she asked. He was strong, which she had expected, and he was patient, which she had not entirely, and when she drove the last wedge home and the king post locked into place with a solid, satisfying thunk that she felt in her palms and her sternum, he held the beam steady for another full minute until she checked the joints from both sides. "You can let go," she said. He let go. The structure held. She stepped back and looked at it. It was a good bridge. Not beautiful, but honest and sound, the kind of thing that would last 10 years with modest maintenance. She felt the satisfaction of it move through her like something warm. Isaiah Hunter was looking at it too, his arms loose at his sides, and he said very quietly, "That is good work." "Thank you," Ellen said. There was a pause that was different from the other silences. It had a different texture. She was aware of him standing 2 feet to her right in a way that was specific and particular, not threatening, not uncomfortable, just present. She said, "I do not know your name." He said, "Isaiah Hunter." "Ellen Garrison," she said. They shook hands the way men shook hands, because that was what was natural in that moment, and neither of them thought about it until afterward. "You bought the lumber," she said. It was not a question. "There was a mill at the bottom of the East Road," he said. "How much did it cost you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said. "I intend to pay you back." He looked at her, and she had the sense that he was weighing something, deciding something. He said, "Pay it forward when you can. There will be someone who needs it." Ellen considered this. It was a gracious answer. It was also the answer of someone who was not interested in creating a debt between them, which told her something. She said, "You have been watching from the trees since the second morning." He was quiet. "I am not complaining," she said. "I am telling you that I noticed, and that I think it was because you were concerned something might go wrong, not because you had any ill intent, and you can tell me if I have read that incorrectly." He said after a moment, "You read it correctly." "Then thank you," she said. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the bridge. The creek moved under it, cold and fast and indifferent. Then Ellen said, "There is still the decking and the rails and the approach grading. That is another 2 days of work." He said nothing, but he did not leave. She went back to her tools. She picked up the broadaxe. She began measuring and marking the deck planks. Behind her, after a moment, she heard the sound of a second broadaxe beginning to move against wood. She did not turn around, but she allowed herself, privately, to feel something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but was in some neighborhood of both. They worked side by side through that morning without speaking more than was necessary for the work, which was the kind of communication she had not had since before Thomas got sick, practical and exact, a shared language of angles and measurements and the specific vocabulary of timber and iron. She found that Isaiah Hunter did not offer advice unless he saw something that was genuinely a problem, and when he did, he said it once and left the decision to her. He seemed to understand, without it being said, that this was her bridge, that she had designed it and driven it, and that he was assisting, not directing. This understanding, which she had not expected from any man, and certainly not from a stranger in 1874 in the Colorado territories, was something she turned over in her mind during the quiet stretches of work, the way you turn a smooth stone in your pocket. At midday she boiled coffee on her campfire, and he accepted a cup without being asked to stay for it, just settled on the back wheel of her wagon with his hat in his hand and drank it. She noticed, looking at him in the full noon light, that he had a thin scar along his jaw that she had not seen in the morning shadows, and that his hands were scarred in ways that spoke of hard work over many years rather than violence, and that he had the particular stillness of someone who had spent a great deal of time alone, not unhappy stillness, just accustomed. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because it seemed reasonable to ask. "Silver Vale," he said. "Work at the Marsh Brothers freight operation." Ellen stared at him. "Dorothea Marsh's relation." He looked up from his coffee. "You know the Marshes." "I have a letter from Dorothea Marsh offering me work on the western side," Ellen said. "That is where I am going." Isaiah looked at her for a moment, and something moved in his expression, brief and contained, that she might have imagined. He said, "Small territory." "Very," she said. They went back to work after that, and something had shifted between them in the particular way that coincidences shift things, not dramatically, just slightly recalibrated. The way a compass needle settles a degree or two when you are standing on better ground. By the end of the second full day of working together, the deck planking was down and the near side railing was complete. Ellen had eaten her last salt pork that morning, and her hardtack was down to 3 pieces. Isaiah had not offered food and she had not asked, but when the light went that evening, he disappeared for about 20 minutes and came back with a wrapped cloth that contained cornbread and a small pot of beans that he had somehow produced from his saddlebag provisions. Ellen looked at the food and then at him. "I cooked extra," he said, in a tone that invited no particular discussion of the matter. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it, short and genuine, and it surprised her as much as it apparently surprised him, because he looked at her with something in his eyes that was warm and unguarded for just a moment before he looked back at the pot. "Thank you, Isaiah," she said. "It is only beans," he said. But she noticed that he said her name once, a little while later, in the context of passing her the cornbread, and it sat in her ear in a way she was not going to think about directly. They finished the bridge on the morning of the 9th day. The far side railing went in just before noon, the last iron spike driven flush with the wood, the approach on the western bank graded smooth. Ellen walked across the finished bridge, testing each plank, pressing each railing, feeling the whole structure respond to her weight with the solid, even flex of a well-made thing. She walked back. She walked across again, this time at a normal pace, the way anyone crossing would. Isaiah was on the eastern bank, watching. She came back across and stood before him and looked at the bridge one more time. The creek was still cold and fast and unconcerned. The bridge stood over it clean and honest and sure. "It will hold loaded freight wagons," she said. "Yes, it will," he agreed. "We should test it with the mule and the wagon before I hitch up and drive across." They led the mule and the fully loaded wagon across. The bridge did not shift or creak with any alarm. It was sound. Ellen stood on the far bank and looked back at the eastern side. At the pine slope she had been sleeping under for 9 nights. At the cold fire ring and the empty road. She had come to the west side. She did not know exactly what she felt. It was large and complicated and had grief in it, because everything she had built here had also been a kind of distance traveled from Thomas and from the life that had not worked. And now that distance was real and wooden and spanning a real creek, and there was no taking it back. But underneath the grief was something else, something that was less afraid than she had been 11 days ago when she arrived alone at the edge of a broken bridge with nothing but timber and determination. Isaiah had led his horse across and was checking the bay's saddle. He had his hat on again, pulled down in the trail way, ready to ride. She said, "Isaiah." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the work, for doing it the way you did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did not need much help." "I needed some," she said, "and you gave it without making me smaller for needing it." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and this time he did not look away from her and she did not look away from him, and the moment lasted longer than most moments did. He said, "Silver Vale is 18 miles on this road. I will ride ahead and let you set your own pace." She nodded. "I will see you there then." He swung up onto the dark bay and turned the horse down the western road. He did not look back, and she was glad, because she was watching him go with an expression she would not have wanted to explain. Silver Vale in 1874 was a mining and ranching town of about 400 souls, sitting in a mountain valley where a river ran wide and cold through stands of cottonwood, and the surrounding hills held silver deposits that had been drawing men west for the better part of a decade. It had 2 churches, 3 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, a doctor's office, a small hotel, and a scattering of houses ranging from log cabins to a few proper board-and batten structures that spoke of people planning to stay. It was the kind of town that was still deciding what it was going to be when it grew up. Dorothea Marsh was a woman of 52 who ran her household and her opinions with equal efficiency. A small woman with white hair and sharp brown eyes, who had come west with her husband Franklin 20 years ago, and had been running everything practical about their operation since he broke his leg 3 years back, and had never quite walked right again. When Ellen arrived at the Marsh house at the end of a long afternoon's drive, Dorothea came out to the gate and looked at her and then looked at the mule and the wagon and said, "You are tougher than your letter made you sound." "I have had a difficult spring," Ellen said. "I know," Dorothea said. "I heard about Thomas. I am sorry for it. Come in and eat something." The Marsh house was large by Silver Vale standards, built for a family that included Franklin, Dorothea, their grown son Cooper, who ran the freight operation, and a hired hand named Roscoe who had been with them 12 years and was considered more or less family. There was a room at the back of the house that Dorothea had furnished simply but cleanly, and Ellen stood in the doorway of it that evening with her hands empty and felt the particular relief of a person who has been moving for a long time and finally stopped. She asked Dorothea, as carefully as she could, whether a man named Isaiah Hunter had arrived. Dorothea looked at her with a measuring expression and said, "He rode in this afternoon. He is already working. Cooper hired him on the spot. Do you know him?" "We worked on the pass bridge together," Ellen said. "He helped me." Dorothea held her gaze for a moment, evaluating something. Then she said, "Isaiah Hunter is a good man, Ellen, a quiet one but good." "How do you know him?" "Cooper worked with him last summer down in the Animas country. He came highly recommended and he earned it." She paused. "He does not talk much about his past." "No," Ellen agreed, "he does not." She saw Isaiah the next morning at breakfast, because the Marsh household operated on the understanding that working people needed feeding, and the kitchen was a communal place. He was already at the table when she came in, talking in a low voice to Cooper Marsh about a freight route, and he looked up when she entered and said good morning with the particular quality of someone who was simultaneously unsurprised to see her and paying very close attention. "Good morning," Ellen said. Cooper Marsh was a big, cheerful man of about 35 with a red beard and a direct manner, and he looked between them with undisguised curiosity and said, "Isaiah tells me you built the Harrow Pass Bridge more or less single-handed." "I had some assistance at the end," Ellen said, setting down her coffee cup. "I helped hold one beam," Isaiah said, in a tone that was almost dry enough to be humor. "He is being modest," Ellen said. She sat across the table from him, and past the biscuits and the conversation moved to other things, freight schedules and the state of the roads, and a report of a landslide on the North Road that needed attention. But she was aware, in the quiet way she was aware of most things, of the fact that Isaiah Hunter was 3 feet across a breakfast table from her, and that this was the most comfortable she had felt around another person in quite some time. She began her work for the Marshes that week, which consisted primarily of cooking the large household meals, mending and laundering for the family, and 2 afternoons a week helping Dorothea with a small informal dressmaking operation that served the women of Silver Vale. It was honest work, and she was good at it, though the cooking and the laundering were less interesting to her than the dressmaking, which required the same precise measurement and structural thinking as carpentry, and which Dorothea taught her with the satisfaction of passing a skill to someone who was going to actually use it. Isaiah was out on freight runs most days and absent from the household for stretches of 2 and 3 days at a time. When he was home, which was the word Ellen privately used for the Marsh house even though it was not her home and not his, there was a pattern that developed between them that was so gradual and natural that she did not notice it as a pattern until it was already established. He would come in from the road and she would have the kitchen stove going, and he would pour himself coffee without being offered it and sit at the kitchen table while she finished whatever she was doing, and they would talk. Not about important things at first, about the road conditions and what towns he had passed through and what she had heard from the women of Silver Vale that week. About the freight horses and the mule, who was still living at the Marsh livery and had become inexplicably devoted to the bay horse. About the silver mine east of town that was playing out and what that would mean for the valley. But gradually the conversations deepened the way conversations do between people who are paying attention to each other. And one evening in late June, 6 weeks after she had arrived in Silver Vale, she told him about Thomas, about the ranch and the debts and the fever and the grave outside Pueblo. And she told it simply and without decoration because she had found that the best way to carry grief was to not wrap it in anything, to just let it sit plain. Isaiah listened. He did not offer comfort in the hollow way people offered it, did not say things were better now or that God had a plan. He said after a quiet moment, was it a good marriage? She thought about it honestly. It was a decent one, she said. We were kind to each other. There was not much fire in it, but there was respect, and that is more than some people have. Yes, he said, that is more than some people have. There was something in the way he said it that suggested he knew this from experience, that he had perhaps had one or the other but not both, and she wanted to ask but did not. She said instead, "What made you leave the army?" The silence that followed was different from his ordinary silences. It was heavier. She watched him look at the surface of his coffee cup and then at the wall. He said finally, "I scouted for the 7th Cavalry for 4 years. I was good at it. And then I was at places where the orders were not ones a man could follow and feel that he was still a man afterward, and I made a choice." He paused. There were people on the other side of those orders who did nothing wrong except to be in the way of what we wanted, and that is a thing that does not leave you regardless of how far west you ride. He said it plainly, without drama, the way she had told him about Thomas. She understood, fully and without his needing to explain further, what he was describing. She knew about Sand Creek and about what had been done in the name of the Army and expansion in Colorado and the territories, and she understood that a man with a conscience and a uniform could find himself on the wrong side of history very easily, and that the question was what he chose to do when he understood that. She said, "You got out." "I got out," he agreed, "for whatever that is worth." "It is worth something," she said. He looked at her then, and there was a quality to the look that she had not seen in him before, something that was asking a question while also not wanting to ask it, and she held it without looking away. He said, "Ellen." The way he said her name was different from all the other times he had said it. She could feel the difference in her sternum. She said, "Yes," he said, "I am not a man who has much to offer by conventional measure. I have a horse and a bedroll and about $40 saved and no land and no certain future," she said. "I have a mule and a room in someone else's house and less than $40. A very small smile crossed his face. It was the first time she had seen him fully smile, and it changed his face in a way that made her feel slightly unsteady. "I am trying to tell you something," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Tell me then." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I have been thinking about you since the first morning I saw you standing on that bridge framework with an axe in your hand like you were exactly where you were supposed to be. And I have not stopped thinking about you since. And I am telling you because it seems dishonest to keep not telling you." Ellen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night sounds of Silver Vale moved through the open window, someone playing a fiddle 2 streets over, the creek running its patient course at the edge of town. She said, "I have been thinking about you too." "Since when?" he asked, and he sounded genuinely curious rather than vain about it. "Since you left those boards before dawn," she said, without a word, without any expectation. He nodded slowly as if this made a certain sense to him. She said, "I am not in a hurry for anything, Isaiah. I spent a marriage being steady and practical and responsible, and I am glad I did. And I am not interested in rushing into something just because we are both in the same town and we have an easy conversation. But I am also telling you that what I feel when you are in the room is not nothing." "It is not nothing on this side either," he said quietly. They sat in that for a while, the kitchen warm around them, the fiddle drifting through the window, the coffee going cold in their cups. Eventually, Dorothea came through on her way to bed and looked at them at the kitchen table and said, with the bluntness of a woman who had been alive long enough to call things what they were, "Good evening, you two," and went upstairs without another word. Ellen laughed, and Isaiah laughed too, a low, genuine sound that she decided she wanted to hear more of. The summer of 1874 moved through Silver Vale in a long golden progression of warm days and cool nights, and Ellen Garrison and Isaiah Hunter moved through it carefully and honestly, the way people move through something they do not want to damage by going too fast. He brought her back small things from his freight runs. A book from a trading post 3 towns over when she mentioned she had not read anything since before Thomas died. A bolt of blue calico she had admired in the Marsh's supply inventory and then decided she could not afford. He left the calico on her workbench without a note, and she found it and went to him and said, "You have to stop doing this." He said, "The blue is the right color for your eyes." She stopped. She said, "My eyes are gray." "They are gray and green, and on certain days they are almost blue," he said, "and the calico is the right color." She held his gaze. She said, "Thank you." "You are welcome," he said, and there was something between them in that simple exchange that was quiet and profound and absolutely inevitable. She made herself a dress from the calico. She wore it to the town's 4th of July gathering, which was the kind of informal social occasion that Silver Vale managed with a long table of food, and a hired fiddler and considerable amounts of whatever was being distilled locally. And Isaiah Hunter found her in the crowd and stood beside her, and did not dance but watched her dance with Cooper Marsh, and with Franklin Marsh, who was moved enough by the occasion to manage one slow circuit of the cleared ground despite his bad leg. And when she came back to him breathless and laughing, he handed her a cup of lemonade and looked at her in the blue dress with an expression that he did not even try to disguise. She looked back at him in kind. Afterward, walking back through the evening streets, she took his hand without either of them making a particular decision about it, and he held it with a firm, warm pressure, and they walked without talking until they reached the gate of the Marsh house, and he stopped there and looked at her in the last of the evening light. He said, "I want to court you properly, Ellen, if that is something you are willing to consider." She said, "I have been considering it since June." He smiled again, that full smile, and she thought she could probably look at it indefinitely. "Then I am formally asking," he said. "I am formally accepting," she said. They stood at the gate in the warm summer evening, and he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was a formal gesture and a tender one, and she felt it from her knuckles to her heart. The courtship that followed was as much a part of who they were as everything that had come before it, unhurried and genuine, and built on the long evenings of conversation and the shared language of work that had been there from the beginning. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons along the creek road, and they talked about everything: his years in the territories, her childhood in Missouri with her carpenter father, the questions about land and future that both of them were beginning to turn toward. She learned that he had a sister in St. Louis, whom he wrote to occasionally, and who wrote back with the devoted persistence of someone who loved a quiet brother, and was not going to let him disappear into the West entirely. Her name was Clara, and she was married to a printer and had 4 children, and from her letters, which Isaiah read passages of aloud with a warmth that surprised and pleased Ellen, she was a sensible and funny woman. He learned that Ellen had been reading since she was 4 years old, that she had a passion for civil engineering and structural mechanics, that she had educated entirely from books and practice, because no school in 1874 was going to teach a woman what she actually wanted to know, that she had a fury about this that she kept well banked, but that came out sometimes when she was tired, a clean, cold anger that was not self-pity but something much more useful and pointed. He said when she described some of this one evening, "You should be building things." She said, "I am aware." He said, "I mean that what you did at Harrow Pass and the way you did it, that is not a talent for carpentry. That is a talent for engineering. There are places even now where that could be put to use." She looked at him. "You mean I could find work as a builder?" "I mean you could find work as someone who understands load and structure and the mechanics of it," he said. Cooper Marsh needs someone who can assess the bridges and culverts on the freight routes. He is currently guessing at which ones will hold freight loads and occasionally being wrong about it. "I have watched you do what you do, and you know things he does not know." Ellen sat with this for a moment. She had not thought of it in those terms. She had thought of the bridge at Harrow Pass as necessity, as a problem she solved because it was in front of her. She had not thought of it as a credential. She said, "You think Cooper would take that seriously?" "I think Cooper Marsh takes anything seriously that affects whether his freight arrives intact," Isaiah said. "He is a practical man." She talked to Cooper the following week. It took 20 minutes and one conversation about the structural failure on the South Fork Bridge that had collapsed under a loaded timber wagon the previous winter, a collapse she identified from Cooper's description as a simple failure of the lateral bracing, a thing she could see in her mind as clearly as if she were standing there, and Cooper Marsh leaned back in his chair and looked at her and said, "How would you fix it?" she told him. He hired her. It was not a grand salary. It was a surveyor's fee paid per assessment, but it was real work and skilled work, and it was hers. And when she told Isaiah that evening, she could see in his face that he was genuinely, quietly delighted for her, not proud in the possessive way that men were sometimes proud of women, but glad, glad for her specifically, glad that she was getting something she deserved. She kissed him that evening for the first time. It was not a grand production. They were standing in the back garden of the Marsh house, and she had been talking about a culvert design, and he had been listening with that full attention he gave everything. And there was a moment when the conversation simply paused, and she thought clearly and without drama that she wanted to, and she did. She turned and kissed him, and he was still for one surprised heartbeat, and then he kissed her back with a warmth and a care that was entirely him, holding her face in his hands as if she were something he wanted to look at while he was doing it. When it ended, they were both quiet for a moment. He said, "I have been wanting to do that since July." She said, "I know." "Was it that obvious?" "Only to me," she said, "and I have been paying attention." He laughed, and she kissed him again just because she wanted to hear what that laugh sounded like from closer. The summer moved toward autumn. The aspens in the high country turned gold and the air sharpened, and the freight runs grew heavier as people stocked up for winter. And Isaiah was on the road more, and Ellen was out on assessment trips along the freight routes more, and they saw each other in the evenings, and on Sundays, and wrote each other notes when one of them was away, brief practical notes that occasionally contained things that were not practical at all. That were the quiet language of two people who were finding their way toward each other with increasing certainty. In September, a man came through Silver Vale named Barlow Dunn, a land speculator from Denver who was buying up town lots and property on the theory that the railroad would come through the valley and make every acre worth 10 times what it costs today. He was smooth and well-dressed and spoke with the practiced confidence of someone who had made money by being confident at exactly the right moment. And he noticed Ellen Garrison in a way that she noticed and did not appreciate. He approached her 3 times over the course of 4 days that he spent in Silver Vale. The first time was at the general store, where he introduced himself with unnecessary formality and expressed admiration for her assessor work in a way that managed to be condescending and flattering at the same time. The second time was at a supper at the Marsh House to which Cooper had invited him on business grounds, where he made a point of sitting beside her and directing more of his conversation at her than at anyone else. The third time was on the street outside the livery where she was checking on the mule, and he came up beside her and said that he thought a woman of her capabilities was wasting herself in a small mountain town, and that Denver had considerably more to offer a woman who knew her own worth. Ellen turned and looked at him with great calm and said, "I appreciate the thought. I'm not interested in Denver or in whatever you are proposing." He smiled the smile of a man who was not used to simple refusals and said that perhaps she would think about it. She said, "I will not." He went away, and she did not think about him much after that, and she told Isaiah about it that evening partly because she believed in telling him things and partly because she wanted to see his face. His face was, as she had expected, very still and very controlled. He said, "Did he trouble you in any way that was more than words?" "No," she said. "He was rude in the way well-dressed men often are, by assuming I wanted what they were offering. I told him I was not interested and he left." Isaiah looked at her. Then he said with a careful quietness, "Is there anything you want me to do about it?" She said, "He is leaving tomorrow. There is nothing to do." "I told you because I tell you things." He nodded. He relaxed something that had been very slightly tense in his shoulders. He said, "Good, I am glad you told me." She said, "Are you jealous?" He considered. "I am not jealous in the small-minded sense. I am something else." "What else?" he said, looking at her directly. "I am a man who is very certain about what he wants and who understands that he has no claim on another person and has to live with that while the certainty grows." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Isaiah." He said, "Yes." "How certain are you?" he said. "Ellen, I have been certain since you told me the axle grease I left was going to be useful. You said it in the same voice you would use to say the weather was fine, and I thought, this woman is exactly who I want to talk to every day for the rest of my life." She felt her throat tighten slightly. She said, "That is quite a thing to say." "I know," he said. "I have been working up to it for several months." She stood up from the kitchen table and crossed to where he was sitting, and he looked up at her, and she sat beside him on the bench, and he put his arm around her shoulders in the first time he had held her that way, not a kiss, just his arm around her and her leaning into him, and they sat like that for a long time in the warm kitchen. The autumn deepened. The first snow came in October, light and glittering, laying a thin layer of white on the valley that melted by afternoon but stayed in the shadows. The mountains wore their heavy snowcaps again, and the trees went bare, and the creek at the edge of town ran with that particular winter clarity that made it look like glass. Isaiah came back from a long freight run in mid-October and found Ellen in the barn, where she had been using the covered space and the spare lumber from a marsh construction project to build a small cabinet for Dorothea's kitchen. It was a fine piece of work, joinery tight, and even, the wood planed smooth. The doors hung with good iron hinges. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at it and then at her. He said, "Marry me." She looked up from the door hinge she was fitting. She said, "You have not been back 3 hours." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 6 hours on the road, and I ran out of arguments against saying it immediately." She set down the hinge. She looked at him. He was standing in the barn doorway with the pale October light behind him, dust from the road still on his coat, his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that was without pretense or performance of any kind. It was simply the face of a man asking a woman the most important question he had ever asked. She said, "We have known each other 6 months." "I know how long it has been," he said. You said you have nothing to offer by conventional measure. I said that in June, he said. In October I have a horse, a bedroll, $63 saved, a steady job with Cooper Marsh, a horse that likes your mule, and the absolute conviction that I would like to spend the rest of my life with you. That is not nothing. Ellen stood up from the barn floor and brushed the sawdust from her apron and looked at him standing in the doorway. And she thought about the bridge at Harrow Pass and the cold fire ring in the trees and the boards left before dawn and all the mornings and evenings since. And she thought about Thomas, who had been decent and kind. And not this feeling that the room recalibrated itself when he walked into it. Not this sense that somewhere in the past 6 months she had become more herself rather than less. And she said, yes. He crossed the barn in 4 steps, and he took her hands and held them and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and full that she felt it like warmth across her whole chest. He said, yes, she said. Yes, Isaiah, I will marry you. He kissed her then, with both of her hands still in his and sawdust in her hair and October light through the barn door. And it was a perfect kiss in the way that kisses are perfect when they are exactly what they are supposed to be. Dorothea, who had watched 2 people fall in love in her kitchen over the course of 5 months, with the satisfaction of a woman who appreciated a good story unfolding correctly, said when told the news, "It is about time," and immediately began discussing whether the wedding could be done before the heavy snows came in. The wedding was held in November of 1874, in the smaller of Silver Vale's 2 churches, on a cold, clear day when the mountains stood white and enormous against the blue sky, and the valley wore a thin coat of frost that sparkled in the morning light. Ellen wore the blue calico dress and a wool cloak of deep brown that Dorothea had given her as a wedding gift. Isaiah wore a clean shirt and a new vest and the best of his trail coats, and he stood at the front of the church with an expression of such complete and settled happiness that Cooper Marsh, standing up beside him as witness, was overheard to remark to his wife afterward that he had never seen a man look so much as if he had arrived somewhere he intended to stay. There were perhaps 30 people at the wedding, which was most of the adult population of Silver Vale that was not occupied with essential tasks, because when a woman who had built a bridge single-handed, and a man who was known for being reliably present and silent and useful decided to get married, people wanted to come. Roscoe the hired hand, who was a man of very few words, cried during the vows, which everyone pretended not to notice. The minister asked Ellen if she took Isaiah Hunter to be her husband, and she said, "I do," looking directly at him with those gray-green eyes, and he looked back at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. The minister asked Isaiah if he took Ellen Garrison to be his wife, and he said, "I do," in that low, steady voice that had told her since the beginning that he meant every word he said, because he chose his words very carefully. They walked out of the church into the cold November morning as husband and wife, and the assembled people of Silver Vale made appropriate noise. And Ellen looked at her husband standing in the frost-glittering morning, and thought that there was a version of her life in which she had never gone to that broken bridge, in which she had found another road to a different town and a different life, and never met the man currently holding her hand in the cold air. And the thought was so stark that she tightened her grip on his hand without meaning to. He looked at her. He said quietly, "Are you all right?" she said. "I am thinking about how unlikely this is." He said, "I think about that too." She said, "What do you think when you think about it?" He said, "I think about a mule that was staked on a patch of grass and a creek running cold, and a woman who stood in the middle of a bridge she had built herself and looked at it like she was measuring it against a standard only she could see. And I think that some roads go exactly where they are supposed to go." Ellen stood in the cold morning light and looked at Isaiah Hunter, her husband, and felt something settle in her chest like the last wedge driven home, like the king post locking into place and the whole structure going solid. Not the end of something, but the completion of something. The bridge finished and the road continuing on the other side. She said, "Come on then. Dorothea has put out an extraordinary quantity of food." He laughed, and they walked together toward the marsh house where the wedding supper was waiting and the fire was going, and the people of Silver Vale had gathered to mark the occasion in the way frontier people marked occasions, with food and noise and a fiddler, and the warm, practical pleasure of a community celebrating something good. The winter of 1874 and into 1875 was long and deep, the way San Juan winters were, with heavy snowfall that closed the mountain roads for weeks at a time and kept Silver Vale largely to itself. This was not a hardship for Isaiah and Ellen Garrison Hunter. They had taken 2 rooms above the marsh stable that Cooper had converted into a small but sound living space, and they spent the winter evenings by their small iron stove reading aloud to each other and talking, long, winding conversations about everything from bridge engineering to history to the question of what they wanted to build toward when the spring roads opened. The question of land had been in both their minds since before the wedding. Ellen had been saving her assessor fees all summer and autumn. Isaiah had his wages from Cooper Marsh. They were not wealthy, but they were not without resources, and the question of whether to stay in Silver Vale or to look for land they could make their own was one they returned to repeatedly through the winter with the pleasure of 2 people who enjoy thinking through a problem together. There was a parcel east of town, about 160 acres on a south-facing slope above the river, that had been filed and abandoned by a miner who had given up and gone back east 3 years prior. The land had a good water source, a spring-fed stream running down from the ridge, and soil that looked, to Ellen's practical eye, like it could grow things if someone was willing to work it. The timber on it was worth something to the sawmill if handled correctly. The slope would get winter sun in a way that the valley bottom did not. They talked about it through December and January and February. They walked out to it 3 times on clear, cold days, walking the boundary and talking about where a house would sit and which direction the slope would have to face to get the most of the short winter sun, and whether the spring stream was reliable year-round. Isaiah said on one of these walks, "You would build the house." Ellen looked at him. "We would build the house." "Yes," he said, "but you would design it." She looked out across the slope with the snow lying thick between the trees and the mountains rising white and enormous behind it. She said, "I have been thinking about a design. Do you want to hear it?" "Very much," he said. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping, about load-bearing walls and window placement and the orientation of the main room and the separate kitchen lean, till she was planning and the root cellar that would go below the frost line, and he listened with his full attention, occasionally asking a question that indicated he was tracking the structural logic of it, and at the end he said, "How long would it take to build?" "1 summer if we work hard," she said. 2 if we are more leisurely about it, he said. "Then we should not be leisurely about it." They filed on the land in March of 1875, under both their names, which required a small argument with the county land office about whether a woman could hold property jointly, an argument that Ellen conducted with the cold, clean fury she kept well-banked and deployed exactly when necessary, and which she won on the grounds of current territorial law, which Cooper Marsh had helped her research through the winter. The land was theirs. Spring came to Silver Vale the way it always came to the mountain country, tentatively and then all at once, the snow pulling back from the valley and the river going high and loud, and the cottonwoods putting out their pale green first leaves. The pass road opened in April, and Ellen drove out to Harrow Pass on a Tuesday morning to check the bridge, something she had been intending to do since the previous fall. Isaiah rode with her. They came around the bend in the pass road, and there it was, her bridge, standing over the spring-swollen creek exactly as she had left it. 2 freight wagons had crossed it on their way east while she watched, the drivers nodding to her without any idea who she was, just another pair on the road. The bridge stood under both wagons with the solid ease of a well-made thing in its element. She stood on the near bank and looked at it and felt the same satisfaction she had felt on the day it was finished, the satisfaction of a made thing still doing what it was made to do. Isaiah stood beside her. He said, "You built that." "We built that," she said. "I held one beam," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice without turning to look. She turned and looked anyway. He was looking at the bridge with his hands in his pockets and a warmth in his face that was both the bridge and her, and she thought, yes, this is exactly the right life. She took his hand. They stood at the bridge in the spring morning and watched two more riders cross before they turned their horses back toward Silver Vale and their land, and the house they were going to build on the south-facing slope, and all the mornings that were waiting for them on the other side. The house took one full summer to frame and sheathe and roof. Ellen's design was good, the kind of good that came from someone who understood structure at a fundamental level. And she and Isaiah worked on it together through the long summer days with help from Cooper Marsh and Roscoe on weekends, and from the men of Silver Vale who showed up on a Saturday in August with tools and their own lumber contributions to raise the roof framing in a single day. The way frontier communities raise things together, because the frontier required it, and the people had not forgotten yet that needing help and giving it were both dignified things. Dorothea Marsh stood at the edge of the worksite that Saturday with her hands folded and watched Ellen Garrison Hunter direct the placement of a ridge beam from ground level, calling out angles and corrections with the complete ease of someone who could not hear a single thing wrong with what she was doing. And she said to her husband Franklin, who was seated beside her in a chair because his legs still did not permit standing for long, "I always thought the women coming west were the bravest ones." Franklin, who had been married to Dorothea for 30 years and was not a stupid man, said, "You were right." By October of 1875, the house on the slope above the river was livable. By December, it was warm and sound and full of the particular quality of a home that has been thought about carefully by someone who intends to stay in it. Ellen had built shelves for her books and a wide kitchen table with good joinery, and a window over the workbench that caught the morning light from the southeast exactly the way she had planned. Isaiah had built a stable for the horses and the mule, solid and deep-heaved against the winter snow, and a tack room off the stable where he kept his tools and his saddle. The land on the south slope, with the spring-fed stream running through it and the winter sun on it, turned out to be exactly what it had looked like it might be. They broke ground the following spring for a kitchen garden and for a small grain plot, nothing ambitious, just enough to reduce what they needed to buy. The timber they logged selectively through the first 2 winters provided both building material and income, handled with the careful judgment of people who intended to be there for a long time and did not want to log themselves out of shelter. Ellen's work with Cooper Marsh's freight operation continued through these years, the bridge and culvert assessments taking her out on the freight roads several times a month, and her reputation for reliable structural judgment spread gradually through the adjacent county. By 1876, she had been hired on 3 separate occasions by parties outside of Marsh Freight to assess construction projects. Once by a mining company building an ore processing structure, once by a ranching family reinforcing a dam on their irrigation channel, once by the Silver Vale Town Council, which was planning a new public building, and had the unusual wisdom to hire someone who actually understood what it was planning to build. She sat at a table with 3 men from the town council and a visiting architect from Denver who had never been west of the Mississippi before the previous year, and she went through his drawings with a methodical care and identified 4 places where his calculations did not account for the specific load conditions of mountain country winter, snow weight and frost heave, and the particular stresses of temperature differential at altitude. And the architect sat very still while she did this, and then said, "These are valid corrections," in the tone of a man who was genuinely surprised and not entirely sure how to process it. The town council hired her to consult on the project. The building stood for 40 years. Isaiah, watching her come home from that meeting with the particular quality of satisfaction that she carried when she had done good work, said, "How did it go?" she said. The architect was competent and humble about it once the evidence was clear, which is the best you can ask for, he said. And the town council, she said, they are going to pay me the same fee they were going to pay the Denver architect for consultation. Isaiah said, good. She said they almost didn't. There was a discussion. He said, I imagine there was. What ended the discussion? Mr. Caldwell, the council chairman, said that what he wanted was a sound building, and that the woman who fixed Harrow Pass Bridge single-handed seemed like the right person to consult about that. Isaiah said, Mr. Caldwell is a sensible man. In the autumn of 1876, Ellen told Isaiah that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen of their house on the South Slope, on a morning when the aspens were gold through the window and the coffee was hot and he was reading a letter from his sister Clara, and she said it simply and directly because that was how she said things. He put the letter down. He looked at her. He said, when? March, she said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands the way he had kissed her for the first time and looked at her for a long moment. And then he put his arms around her and held her, and she let him, pressing her cheek against his chest and feeling his heartbeat. He said into her hair, how do you feel? She said, determined, glad, a little afraid. He said, me too. She pulled back to look at him. She said, you are afraid, he said, of doing it well. Of being what he or she needs. Yes, she said, you will be exceptional at it. He said, how can you know that? She said, because you have been thinking about other people's needs since before I met you. You left boards before dawn without a word. That is not a man who fails at care. He looked at her with an expression she loved above almost all his other expressions, the one where he was moved and trying not to show it and failing slightly, and she kissed him. The baby was born in March of 1877, a boy, delivered by the Silver Veil doctor and assisted by Dorothea Marsh, who had been present at every birth of consequence in the valley for 20 years and saw no reason to stop. He came into the world on a morning when there was still snow on the ground outside, and the sun was high and clear, and he was healthy and loud, and had a significant quantity of dark hair that Isaiah looked at with the expression of a man who is completely unprepared for the depth of feeling currently occurring inside him. They named him Thomas James Hunter. Thomas for the man Ellen had been married to before, who had been decent and kind and deserved to be remembered, and James for Isaiah's father, who had been a farmer in Ohio and who Isaiah said had been a good and quiet man. Thomas James Hunter grew up on the South Slope above the Silver Veil River, knowing how to ride a horse before he was 4 and how to read by 5, taught by his mother, who was not willing to wait for a school teacher to be in a position to teach her son, and who would have taught him structural mechanics by 7 if he had shown any inclination for it, which he had, in fact, to her considerable delight. He knew that his mother had built a bridge by herself before he was born, because she told him so when he was old enough to ask why people's eyes went a particular way when they mentioned her name in the valley. He knew that his father had helped from the second morning without being asked and without making a performance of it, because Isaiah told him this himself on the morning of Thomas's 7th birthday, as they were riding out together to check the fence line on the North Meadow. Isaiah said, "Your mother is the most capable person I have ever met. She was building something that mattered and she did not need me to make it work. But I could be useful, and being useful in the service of something good was enough reason to be there. That is a principle I have tried to live by, and I hope you will too." Thomas was 7 and therefore processing this at 7-year-old depth, but he nodded seriously and said, "Like when I helped Roscoe fix the barn door even though he did not ask me." Isaiah said, "Exactly like that." 2 years after Thomas was born, in 1879, Ellen had another child, a girl they named Clara Me Hunter, after Isaiah's sister in St. Louis and after the month of her birth. Clara was, from the first, a completely different human being from her brother, bold and loud where he was careful and quiet, interested in horses to a degree that bordered on the theological, and possessed of a stubbornness that both her parents recognized as genetic, without being entirely sure which side it came from. Isaiah's sister Clara came out from St. Louis in the summer of 1880 to meet the baby she had been named after, and to see the West her brother had written about for 6 years. She was a round, cheerful woman who was as full of words as Isaiah was sparse with them, and she arrived at the Silver Vale station with 3 trunks and 4 children, and a husband named Edmund, who was a small, precise man who looked at the mountains and the valley and the south slope and said in wonder, "You built this. The 2 of you." Isaiah said, "Ellen built most of it." Ellen said, "We built it." Clara Hunter looked at her sister-in-law and said, "I am going to love you," and hugged her before Ellen had quite adjusted to the velocity of it, which made Isaiah laugh in the way Ellen loved, full and genuine and rare. Clara stayed 3 weeks. In that time she formed what would become a lifelong correspondence with Dorothea Marsh, helped Ellen with 2 sewing projects and 1 difficult calculation about the reinforcement of a granary wall that a neighboring rancher had asked Ellen to assess, and told Isaiah, in the privacy of their kitchen while Ellen was outside with the children, that he looked the way she had always hoped he would look, settled and full of something she had not seen in him since before he went into the army. Isaiah said, "I know." Clara said, "She did that." He said, "We did it together." Clara said, "Yes, but she went first." He was quiet, and then he said, "Yes, she went first." The years settled on the south slope with the comfortable weight of a life being lived well. Isaiah's work with Cooper Marsh expanded when Franklin Marsh's health declined in the early 1880s and Cooper took over the full operation, and Isaiah became, effectively, the operations manager for Marsh Freight, overseeing the routes and the drivers and the vehicle maintenance. It was work that suited him, requiring exactly the kind of steady, unshowy competence he had always brought to everything, and Cooper Marsh paid him accordingly. Ellen's reputation as a structural consultant continued to grow through the latter 1870s and into the 1880s, and she became, in the practical terminology of the region, the person you hired when you needed to know whether a thing would hold. She charged fair rates and gave honest assessments, and was known never to tell a client what they wanted to hear when what they needed to hear was different, which made her unpopular occasionally and consistently employed. She had built her own small survey and drafting table in the south room of the house, and she could sometimes be found there late in the evening with a lamp burning, working through calculations for a project with the complete absorption of someone who is doing exactly what they are made for. Isaiah would sometimes come to the doorway of that room and lean against the frame and look at her bent over her drafting table, and she would feel his presence without looking up and say, "I know you are there." And he would say, "I know you do." And she would look up eventually, and he would be looking at her with that expression she had been seeing for 10 years now, and which still did the same thing to her chest that it had done the first time she understood what it meant. And she would say, "Come in, then." And he would come in and sit beside her, and she would show him what she was working on, and he would ask the questions that helped her think through the problem. Because after 10 years of listening to her work, he genuinely understood it. Not the mathematics, but the structural logic, the way things held together or failed to hold, and the conversations they had in the lamplight of that south room were among the conversations she would remember most clearly for all the rest of her life. In 1882, the railroad came to Silver Vale, not the main line, but a spur line connecting the valley to the broader network, and it brought change the way railroads always brought change: faster goods, more people, higher prices on some things and lower on others, a new kind of ambition settling into the town alongside the old. There was a period of adjustment in which some of the things that had made Silver Vale what it was became less necessary, and some new things became very necessary very quickly, and the people who navigated that adjustment best were the ones who understood what they actually had rather than what they wished they had. Cooper Marsh adapted by specializing. With the railroad handling the long hauls, Marsh Freight focused on the routes the railroad could not reach, the high passes and the mining camps and the ranch deliveries, which turned out to be a very sustainable niche. Ellen adapted by taking on the structural work that came with railroad construction itself, and there was considerable structural work, because railroads needed culverts and grade structures and bridge reinforcements, and someone had to assess which of the existing infrastructure could take the new loads and which had to be rebuilt. She went out to Harrow Pass with a railroad survey team in the spring of 1882. The bridge was still standing. It had been standing for 8 years. She walked across it again, testing the planks with her weight, pressing the rails with her hands. Several of the deck planks would want replacing before the year was out. The main structure was still sound. One of the survey team, a young engineer from Cincinnati named Whitfield, who was 23 years old and had not yet learned that confidence and competence were not the same thing, said, looking at the bridge, "This is a rudimentary structure. We will need to reinforce it significantly for freight loads." Ellen said, "The main beams and the stone abutments are sound. You will need to replace the deck planking and add lateral bracing on the downstream side to account for the increased load. The King Post configuration at the center span is adequate for the weight rating you will need if you add the bracing." Whitfield looked at her. He said, "How do you know the weight rating?" Ellen said, "Because I built it and I know what specifications I built it to." There was a silence. Whitfield looked at the bridge and then at her and then at the bridge again. He said, with the particular quality of a man who is rearranging several assumptions simultaneously, "You built this." "In May of 1874, she said. 9 days. Alone. Mostly," she said. "I had some help." She thought about Isaiah standing on the far abutment with his hands braced against a crossbeam, steady and patient, and the sound of 2 axes moving in the morning air. She gave the survey team her assessment. Whitfield incorporated it with good grace and did not argue further. The bridge was reinforced according to her specifications and continued to serve the pass road for another 16 years before a flood finally took one of the abutments, and the county built a new structure on its footprint, larger and with steel components, but set in the same place, over the same creek, spanning the same gap she had first looked at on a cold May morning in 1874, with nothing but timber and stubbornness, and the absolute conviction that the thing needed to be done. Thomas Hunter grew into a young man who combined his mother's structural intelligence with his father's quiet steadiness and became, in due course, a civil engineer, one of the first students from the Silver Vale Valley to attend the Colorado School of Mines, which had opened in Golden in 1874, the same year his parents had met over a broken bridge. He wrote his mother long letters from school about load calculations and material science, and she wrote back with corrections and elaborations that his professors occasionally asked him to bring to class because they were the kind of precisely observed practical notes that textbooks did not contain. Clara Hunter became exactly what her early horsemanship suggested, a woman who ran a horse-breeding operation on the South Slope land that she and her father expanded together in the 1890s, when Isaiah had retired from Marsh Freight and had time for it. She married a rancher's son from the North Valley named Arthur Riley in 1900, and they had 3 children, and she ran her horses and her household with the exact quantity of stubbornness that her parents had recognized as genetic. Isaiah Hunter in his later years was the same person he had always been, quieter perhaps, more comfortable with silence than ever, but with a warmth in him that had been building since the morning he first watched a woman stand on a bridge she was building, and felt something he had not known what to call for a very long time. He sat on the porch of the house on the South Slope in the long evenings and watched the valley below and the mountains above and felt, with the settled contentment of a man who has arrived, that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. He still rode. Into his 60s, he was on horseback most days, checking the fences or riding the creek road or making the trip into Silver Vale for supplies, and the people of the valley who had known him for 20 years and more spoke of him as a man who had been part of the landscape for so long that it was impossible to imagine the landscape without him. Not because he was loud or prominent, but because he was so reliably, quietly there. Ellen built things until her hands would not hold the tools anymore. And then she designed things while other hands built them. And in her late 60s, she wrote down everything she knew about structural mechanics in a series of notebooks that she gave to Thomas, who had them published in a form that circulated through the engineering programs of 3 universities. The preface, which she wrote herself, began with the observation that a bridge is only as good as the ground it stands on, and that understanding what will hold is a matter of paying attention to the actual materials in front of you rather than to the materials you wish you had, and that this principle applied, in her experience, to considerably more than construction. The people who read it took it as engineering philosophy. The people who knew her took it as autobiography. On a morning in late October of 1904, Ellen Garrison Hunter came out onto the porch of the house on the south slope and found her husband already there, sitting in the wooden chair he had occupied on 100,000 mornings, his coffee in his hands, watching the frost on the valley below catch the first sun. The aspens had gone gold, and the mountains wore their early snow, and the river ran bright and cold through the cottonwoods. She sat in the chair beside him, the one that had always been hers, and he handed her the second cup of coffee that he had poured before she came out, because after 30 years he knew her movements and her timing without having to think about it. She held the cup and looked at the valley. She said, "I was thinking about the bridge this morning." He said, "Harrow Pass." "Yes, I was thinking about the morning I finished it and crossed to the western side and looked back at the eastern bank." She paused. "I did not know what was on this side yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Was it worth it, what you found?" She turned and looked at him. He was 62 years old, with gray in his dark hair and lines in his face that spoke of sun and weather, and the quality of a life that had been lived rather than merely inhabited. And he was looking at her with the same attention he had given her since the second morning in a mountain pass in 1874, when he left boards before dawn without any expectation attached to the gesture. And his eyes were exactly as she had first read them, full of activity that did not always reach his face. Warm and deep and entirely focused on her. She said, "You know the answer to that." He said, "I do, but I wanted to hear you say it." She said, "Yes, Isaiah." It was worth every plank and every spike and every cold morning and every sore shoulder. It was worth all of it 100 times over. And if I had to do it again, I would drive to that pass every time. He put his arm around her shoulders, the same way he had held her in the kitchen of the Marsh house in the summer of 1874, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built together on the south slope above the Silver Veil River in the October morning of 1904, and watched the frost burn off in the sun, and the valley below them stretched away toward the mountains in all its wild, impractical, magnificent distance, full of roads and bridges, and the evidence of lives that had been built one careful joint at a time. The mule had been gone for many years, as had the dark bay horse, but their horses now grazed in the lower pasture, Clara's horses, the breeding stock she was so proud of, moving through the morning light in a slow, lovely scatter of color. And the sound of the river and the wind in the aspens was the same sound the valley had always made, unhurried and clean, and absolutely without any interest in the passage of time. Ellen Garrison Hunter drank her coffee and felt the weight of her husband's arm around her and listened to the valley, and she thought that the broken bridge at Harrow Pass had been the truest moment of her life, not because she had fixed it, but because of what it had taught her, that the things worth building were always the ones that let other people across, and that the right person was the one who understood this without being told, who showed up in the second morning and lifted what needed lifting and asked for nothing in return except the same willingness to stay. She had stayed. He had stayed. The valley below them was full of other people crossing, other roads going west, other lives unfolding on the far side of passes that someone had fixed before them, and that someone would fix long after. The great ongoing work of people building things for people they would never meet. the thread of it running all the way back to a cold May morning, and a broadex and a mule staked on a good patch of grass, and the best 20 days of her life, the days that had led to all the rest. She finished her coffee. She said, "Come in for breakfast." He stood up and held out his hand, and she took it, and they went inside together into the warm house and the smell of pine smoke and morning, and the door closed behind them, and the valley went on below in all its golden October light, unhurried, beautiful, and entirely unconcerned with endings, because the valley knew, as valleys do, that what had been built here was not the kind of thing that ended.